Apologies, microphone was off. Let us begin again. All right, as I was saying, welcome to our event, hosted by Black History Arts and the Sarah Parker Remond Centre. In front of you, you can see some of our coming events. We do events like this every single month all year long. Most of the events that you see there are free, and you can access them online. You can just book via Eventbrite or the Black History Walks page. Today's event, we're looking at a film called Belly of the Beast. So if we had a physical film screening, we normally have a Q&A after the physical film screening. So what we've done now is we've had an online screening, and we'll be having the Q&A online as well. So what will happen is that Dr. Shantella Sherman will give us a brief presentation, and then she'll take questions using the chat function. So she's going to speak for maybe half an hour or so, give us some more context to the history of sterilization and indeed eugenics. And after she's finished speaking, we'll take questions using the chat function. So we'll take questions after she's finished speaking using the chat function. So the chat function is at the bottom of your screen, circled in red. So you type your questions there. Of course, you can chat to each other if you wish to. We won't be taking questions until after the main presenter has finished speaking. For those of you asking about recordings, we are recording this session, this one today, and we have recorded other sessions that we've done with the Sarah Parker Remond Centre. So you can find most of the sessions we've done the last 6 months or so, the SPRC, on this page here. So if you go to this page here, youtube.com/blackhistorywalks, you should see about 250 videos, some short, some long, but you'll find the events we've run in association with the Sarah Parker Remond Centre, U.C.L, on this particular channel. So we have recently we just had Black Teacher, the book from Beryl Gilroy from 1976, a classic book about a Black teacher experience in the school system in this country. We've got talks on Kenya and the uprisings there, often referred to as the Mau Mau emergency. We've got talks on Black history at the Tower of London and mental health, how a man called Harry Cumberbatch was able to use history to improve the mental health of a number of African Caribbean people in the area and actually keep them out of being sectioned in hospitals and being given a whole bunch of drugs. So there's a whole bunch of interesting topics on our website there, on the YouTube channel rather, and you can access them there. And this presentation will be put on this website within the week. So within the week, it should be up there. You just go there and check it out for yourselves. So I should say that Black History Walks runs walks, talks, and films on the Black history of London every single month, all year long, for the last 15 years. So in this montage, you can see some people having a good walk in Notting Hill. And then there's, of course, our Black History River Cruise in the bottom left-hand corner. You got a lecture taking place, and that's at Birkbeck about 7 years ago. And bottom right, you have our cinema at the BFI South Bank, where we show films from the African diaspora every single month, all year long for the last 15 years. And these are the types of films we show. The films that you do not find in your Odeon or your View or your regular mainstream cinema. We show these films with a Q&A on a Saturday, 2 o'clock, for about 3 hours. So we show the film, then have a Q&A after the film. Plus we have producers, directors speaking about the films they've made. So it's a very unique event, very unique program, I should say, and a very unique environment. So if you're in London, once a month, normally Saturday, we show these films with a Q&A. So come down and get your tickets for that. Coming events at the BFI South Bank, not far from Waterloo Tube Station, are what we see here. So we have a free cinema session for people who are over 65, and we're going to show some classic films there on the 29th of November. We just missed the Black History of Comedy, which we did live and direct at the BFI. But we have some other stuff coming up in November with, well, not with, but about a legendary Black British civil rights activist called Darcus Howe. So Darcus Howe was a real legend. He was involved in the Black People's Day of Action. He was involved in the Black Panthers. He was involved in the Mangrove 9. And he was also a pioneering Black broadcaster. So we're going to show a number of his films from the 80s and 90s. Plus, we're going to have some of the people he worked with on stage discussing his work and his legacy. So that takes place in November, and you can get the tickets from, well, from now, I should think. This is a sample of the walks that we do, and we have about 12 different walks, north, east, and southwest London. And the walks, of course, linking the talks and, of course, the films. But what we've done is we actually have taken one of our Black History walks in Notting Hill and made it into a GCSE exam textbook that's being used in schools right now. So up until this book came out, you would not have any idea about studying the Mangrove 9 or Darkest Howe or the Notting Hill uprisings in 58. That was not on the curriculum, but now, because of our work, because we work with Pearson in their GCSE exam textbook, if your child is at school, you can choose to do this GCSE subject and study Black British civil rights. So we're looking at the 1940s and 1970s. We're covering Partner, Susu, Boxer. We're talking about housing. We're talking about World War II. We're talking about Claudia Jones, talking about Carnival. We're talking about the Mangrove 9, Frank Critchlow, and a whole bunch of not that well known history, but now you can study it at GCSE level in schools. So that book is out now from Pearson. Here's a sample of it. We're looking at the Mangrove 9, what made it happen, how it happened, who was in charge, how it was done, etc. It's all there in that book. And we use a lot of not that well known, but authentic references from the Black community. That's throughout the entire book. When it comes to other events, apart from doing the films in the book, you've got a bunch of them there. And this one about sterilization is one of them, but you can pick and choose from the other ones there. So for example, the 20th September one, that has 1,200 people registered for it. 1,200 people registered for that so far. And basically it's Judge Peter Herbert discussing how he took on the law, literally took on the judiciary, and indeed kind of won his case. So he's going to speak about his process, how he did it, and what's going to happen next. And of course, you can see there's a couple of events that mention Darkest Howe. There's a talk by his partner, Leila Hassan Howe, who is a legend in her own right. But she'll be speaking about her life with Darkest and telling the stories that we might not have heard about before. And of course, there's Black British civil rights behind the scenes, looking at a number of Black British civil rights activities, organizations, and venues in London, which is on in late November too. So if you've never heard of Sarah Parker Remond Centre, that's a bit about it. U.C.L is the University College of London, which is a very well-known university in central London. And the SPRC came out of student protests, literally came out of student demands. And they said, look, this situation is not good enough. We want to have a more diverse curriculum, we want to have more diverse staff. And as a result of student protests, student kind of demands, you have the SPRC being created. Headed up by Professor Paul Gilroy, they research race and racialization, which of course includes history and empire and a number of different subtopics. So they have regular podcasts. This is just one of them. And they kind of curate academics who are experts in race, racialization, history, politics, empire, etc. And they do a lot of work at that venue, and they, do podcasts. This is just one of them, but they have a whole list of podcasts, which you can see here, and you can kind of listen to them, pick and choose. And this is all really interesting academic research, which, at one time was not that well funded or not that well regarded. But the SPRC, Sarah Parker Remond Centre, is highlighting and showcasing and making this topic a lot more mainstream than it was before. But as far as today is concerned, we're going to hear from Dr. Shantella Sherman, who's written that book. So right-hand side of your top of your image there is In Search of Purity by Shantella Sherman. And that is about eugenics in America. I did just mention U.C.L, and I'm not sure if you're aware that U.C.L was actually the center of the eugenics movement at one time. So there's a guy called Francis Galton, some other people, and they were very much into and were in favor of eugenics, which means selective breeding. So of course that links to sterilization, which is what Belly the Beast is all about. And hopefully you've been able to watch that film. If not, you still have some time to watch it before the thing runs out. but this is a Q&A around that film. Dr. Shantella Sherman will tell us a bit more, give us a bit more context about sterilization in America. And then after she's finished speaking, we'll take questions using the chat function. So without further ado, let me hand over to Dr. Shantella Sherman.
Thank you so much. I am always honored to be among you. I do wish that I could get back to London soon to see you lovely people in person. However, Tony has done an amazing job of pulling me in through a virtual space. And so I'm grateful as always. And I welcome you to what is part of my life's work at this point. I began my eugenics studies probably 20 years ago. And I would say that in the last 10 years or so, I've come across a lot of information that helped me understand as a historian that a lot of what I studied as historical eugenics was actually still taking place today. Many of the theories have not fallen away. Many of the theories are still very, very much in place. And it's like a sprinkler system. So instead of this just being about biology and genetics and genomes, it's also about housing policy. It's about immigration policy. It's about education policy. It's about law enforcement. It's about who is arrested and who fits the description. It's about almost any and everything you can think of, including popular culture. And so in forming the Acumen Group, which also has a quarterly magazine called Acumen Magazine, what we determined was that in addition to bringing you information about eugenics so that you understand its tentacles, its reach, and its history, we also want to make sure that we give you tools so that you are aware of eugenic constructs that are all around you. Some things are racial, some things are racist, and other things are eugenic. And sometimes there's an overlap. The Acumen Group does online courses always and often through Black History Walks, but we also do them through our website and just anyone who needs to have a bit of insight. We accept questions from folks, people who are working on dissertations or studies in their own right, whether it's social work or medical policies or law, whatever it is. Sometimes they'll contact us to just kind of get a bit of insight. With the film Belly of the Beast, it hit for us a home run as far as ensuring that the average person understood not just the historical links to eugenics, but how the policies and theories of eugenics became a part of the systemic sterilization, primarily of African-American women here in this country, but then with a much broader brush of any population that was considered marginalized across the globe. All right, so there's a lot of reach with this, and many of the policies, I'm glad that Tony brought this up. U.C.L. is one space where where Charles Galton, Francis Galton, and others in these eugenic spaces came up with it. America's where most of it was actualized, but in other spaces, it went wherever imperialism went. And so what I'm going to do is give you a brief intro, if we can, to eugenics and part of what we're talking about. And then we're going to open up the conversation so that any questions that you have about the film itself and any questions that you have in general about eugenics and some of the things that I'm going to talk about, please feel free to ask them. This is a safe space. So irrespective of how you may think the question will come across, I want you to ask it so that I could be the person to gently respond to it and kind of give you some insight. So please don't be shy once we open the floor. So many of you may have heard at this point about therapeutic sterilizations that are taking place specifically in England, right? And I'm gonna kind of loop around a little bit. So we'll talk about Belly of the Beast, but also some of the current events issues that are going on right now. For sterilizations, the process is when a person is sterilized, reproductively cut off, tubal ligations, vasectomies, and it's still a part of a law. Many of our countries, many of our states, many of our counties still have laws on the books that say a person can be sterilized by the government if it's for their health. And so you have to label a person as disabled. So a person with disabilities automatically can be sterilized, especially if they're young girls or adolescents, and it's believed that sterilizing them is for the better of society. One, to keep down illegitimate births, children born out of wedlock, but also if it's believed that the person is inept mentally to a point where they won't be able to care for themselves, and the person as well as their offspring will end up being a burden, quote unquote, on the state or on the government. So if you're poor, for instance, you are automatically targeted for some of these procedures. If you're an immigrant, you're automatically targeted for some of these procedures. And you'll find it, if you're taking IQ tests, still in this day and age, many times the results of those IQ tests go specifically towards being able to categorize and label certain groups of people to call them disabled. Again, in England, in 2015, The Guardian reported that, you have people coming before different judges to try and determine if a person can be sterilized for learning disabilities. Now, at 36 years old, it's hardly possible that this mother of 6, who is in a relationship long-term, so the father of the children are there, even though technically when they label it like this, she's not married to the father. So long-term partner there. It's believed that she has learning disabilities. Now, it doesn't mean that she's a threat to her children or to herself. However, you have a case that comes before a Justice Cobb, who determines that this person needed to be sterilized because it was for their own safety. And what you'll also find, the notes on this, is that the rationale came because the person's IQ was measured. IQ is already, your intelligence quotient has already been seen to be fallible. If you don't know the answers to particular questions, or you're taking standardized tests, you may not get the answers right, but that does not mean in any way that you are socially deficient. But to say that a person should no longer have children and be cut off from having children specifically because they only got a 70 on an IQ test kind of shows where there's a particular lean towards sterilizing this person in the first place. And what we find with this case, which is also, it was rather disheartening, is that the judge actually gave social services the ability to force their way into this person's home, to restrain them if necessary, and to take them into custody specifically in order to do this process, to do this procedure. So it says that this woman absolutely did not want this done. At the same time, a few years earlier, a 21-year-old woman went before this same judge who had Down syndrome, and it was decided that this person should not be sterilized because she came from, quote unquote, a good home. So this was not about her ability, her capacity. There's something else that's amiss within these types of spaces. So there's an idea of having a balance between protection and empowerment. But what does that mean? If you're in some instances trying to disempower certain groups of people, it means that you're automatically using a scale that's not tipped, it's not balanced, it's tipped in favor or at a disadvantage for some groups of people. Involuntary sterilizations globally have been going on probably since the turn of the century, 1900. And again, this idea of women with disabilities comes into practice. It comes in constantly. Racial minorities, people who are quote unquote disabled, people who are alcoholics or who have specific illnesses are automatically targeted. This PowerPoint, as I'm going through it, this will also be provided to you if you would like it. So don't feel like you need to, quick read through it. But just understand that a lot of what is in the documentary Belly of the Beast is also taking place in many instances in the spaces where you live. But once again, because they're systems and they're a part of the law, you don't necessarily know that they're taking place. And unfortunately, many of the people who fall victim to these practices do not talk about them once they've had them happen to them. So how is the term disabilities defined? Another amazing documentary that came up not too long ago in England was Subnormal, a British Scandal. And with that, once again, you find that a whole group of Black youth in the 1960s were wrongfully labeled as being deficient, mentally deficient, and also socially defective. These are decidedly eugenic terms. These are terms that came out of the 1840s, 1850s, where again, you're trying to basically call people who are non-white animals. And so we'll get into this when I go back through the history of this, but the belief is that you have subhuman people that are among a group of humans. And so the concept of being subnormal, what is normal? And so if you're using a school system to determine who is quote unquote defective, you can easily start to push people into carceral states, meaning in prisons, in asylums, or in treatment facilities. And once they're in those facilities, that is where the sterilizations tend to take place. So there's a connectivity to all of these spaces, and also within pop culture, where you start to have the average person on the street look for what is called a visual stigmata. And that means if you've ever heard someone say this person is too tall, or their eyes look different, it's something about them looks like they don't belong, like they're not normal, quote unquote. Those are the types of things that were kind of bred into people through popular culture, where you determine who's considered normal and who's not considered normal. And then you basically report them to certain officials who would then slate them for sterilization if need be. So with Belly of the Beast, those of you who have seen the film will recognize this young woman as Kelli Dillon, who was sterilized against her consent at the age of 24. What made this case particularly volatile and memorable is that it gets into the history of her own abuse. She was imprisoned for defending herself and her children against an abusive husband, and she ended up shooting him and killing him. Now, no services were called in to try and assist her during the years of abuse that she suffered. But once she actually killed her husband, she was placed in prison and she served a 15-year sentence. Within this space, you see in the documentary just how ridiculously poor the healthcare system is within the prison. Once you are behind those fences and those gates, you lose your rights. And basically, this young woman was subject to a sterilization procedure based upon the fact that a doctor said she had abnormal cancer cells. She had the presence of cancer cells in a general pap smear. It turns out she didn't. It turns out she, along with thousands of other young women, had just been targeted because they were in prison, they were young, they were minority, either Black or Latino women, and it was decided that they would turn around and breed children who would also be criminals. And so based upon this, the belief that they would reproduce weak, dangerous, or weak children, dangerous children, children that would need the help or the safety net of society as opposed to being active citizens, lined her up for this process. Now, what happens in the meantime is after the procedure is done, she's a healthy girl, healthy woman, who said that she went into the prison at roughly 230 pounds. Within months of this procedure, she lost half of her body weight and was down to 115 pounds, which was in and of itself medically a sign that something was going amiss within her system. So the surgery itself caused her to go into early menopause. It weakened her system in all types of ways. She talked about hair loss and other things. No matter what she reported to the doctors within the prison, she was just kind of pushed aside as if it really wasn't a big deal. This documentary, I think, is one of the most important documentaries that you could possibly see to understand how the legal system, carceral states, meaning anytime you're in a prison, an asylum, a treatment center, your rights, your reproductive rights are solely in the hands and at the whim of whatever doctors and administrators are there. And so what we want to do is make sure that I don't want you to watch the documentary and then just feel overwhelmed by this and feel like there's nothing that you can do about it. There are things that you can do. And that is the point of you watching this. So we can give you some tools in the meantime to try and steer this from happening again to other women and to make others aware. So how did we get here? Eugenics, most of you understand eugenics, you've been impacted by eugenics, but you don't know the word and you may not really be familiar with a lot of the things attached to what was considered once to be a science. And the theory still exists today. So eugenics is the science of better breeding. It's an agrarian science, if you want to call it that, where people use the same logic that you would use with plants or animals. If you want to cross-pollinate plants or cross-breed animals, the belief is that you can breed people to have the best possible product. So when we talk about genome therapies and things like that today, a lot of it goes back to these old theories that if I can decide the eye color of my children by having someone go in and manipulate the genes, then people are trying to do that now to have designer babies. However, in 1840, 1850, when Francis Galton, Charles Davenport, and these other eugenicists started coming up with these theories, the belief was that in addition to passing on your hair color, your hair texture, things like that within your genes, you also pass through your genes to subsequent generations, things like your character. So if your mother or father was a criminal, then they're going to breed criminals. If you had a great grandparent who was an alcoholic, that alcoholism is tied to you. It's automatically linked within your genes. Poverty was also considered to be in your genes. So if your great grandparents are poor, it is believed that that poverty gene is in you automatically. Now, understanding that eugenics, while in many instances there are racial components to it and absolutely racist components to it, this was a broad brushstroke once again, where this impacted initially a lot of white people. So white people wanted to find what was whiteness, and anything that wasn't along that purity scale, you were either white or non-white. And there were a lot of people who may have been Irish, who may have been French, who may have been Italian, who were also considered to be non-white, just because their genes, as far as they were concerned, their behaviors didn't match up with what was considered to be a part of that purity construct. Within the Black or African strain of this eugenics theory, though, the belief was that all Black people were subhuman. And this is actually written into American law with things like the Dred Scott case in 1854, where the Supreme Court determined that all Black people were considered to be a subspecies and that they were not supposed to be a part of the language of the Constitution when it said all men were created equal, because Black people, because of their African ancestry, did not belong to the human chain. They belonged to an orangutan or monkey chain. You would say this is the most absurd thing you've ever heard, but it is one of the reasons why whenever you get into highly racist spaces where you may have footballers, for instance, who are being mocked or harassed, you have a group of idiots who are throwing bananas at them, making monkey sounds, because they're still following this old eugenic line that all Black people are actually subhuman and a part of a monkey strain. They're at the top of the chimpanzee orangutan scale and the bottom of the human chain. So Eugenics 101, there are two lines of theories with eugenics. The first line is the positive eugenics, which doesn't mean it's actually positive, but it means the things that are progressive towards breeding better people. So the first thing is those with superior stock who have fit genes should only marry or breed with people who have similar genetic fitness. Those who have superior stock should actively work to protect their genetics by avoiding contaminants. Now, in America, when we had Prohibition, we had a 13-year span where you could not have alcohol in this country, 1920 to 1933. That was a direct eugenic construct that said the alcohol was destroying the germplasm of good American people. And so you actually had federal law that said there will be no alcohol in the country whatsoever that was being consumed unless it was for medicinal purposes and you needed to have a doctor's note and prescription for it. Current issues that we're looking at right now when we talk about positive eugenics, fewer white women under the age of 30 are giving birth in England and in Wales than ever before. And so you're starting to see a movement where we're talking about child-free movements within England. Because of this, there are a lot of white British people who have decided to go under voluntary sterilization beginning around 2005. And based upon that, you'll start to see the counter portion of this where you're getting pushbacks on immigration, or you're starting to see where laws or mandates that say if we're going to allow immigrants into this space, they need to be slated for aggressive birth control, or they need to be sterilized. We're looking at, in eugenic terms, is trying to ensure that too many of the wrong type of people aren't having babies, while too few of the right are not having babies. So you're trying to see if you can find a counterbalance. And so it comes off in laws that you're not necessarily paying attention to. The negative eugenics side of this is that inferior stock, those with poor genes, need to be segregated from society in either prisons, asylums, or reformatories, so that they can keep their contamination from others. The second part of that is to ensure that those with inferior stock do not have children at all. So you end up having sterilizations beginning in 1907 in America in the state of Indiana. And eventually these would become laws in 33 different states and some federal spaces. Eugenic classifications, really quickly, again, the idea of your germplasm and the ability to pass on things like sexual illness, criminality, laziness, alcoholism, theft, lying, cheating, all of this is supposed to be in your DNA. The other thing, the other way of trying to classify people is to give them, again, standardized tests. So if you're an immigrant coming into America and you're going through Ellis Island, coming in through, the harbor, and you have the Statue of Liberty there, one of the first things that was done was to have you go through a series of tests and exams. One of those examinations was something where you had to go through a written test. Now, if you're coming from another country, first of all, you probably don't speak English. So the chances of the likelihood that you're going to do great on the test is not that good. But the idea was to try and see if you could determine the worth of the people who were coming in so that you could grade them. And basically what you see is a scale that to some extent, we don't use the terms anymore, but an idiot is a person with a mentality, a mental aptitude of a 3-year-old or under. A low grade imbecile mentality of a 4 to 5-year-old, medium grade imbecile, 6 to 8-year-old, high grade imbecile, 8 to 10-year-old, and then a moron, a 10 to 12-year-old. Within this category is also an overarching classification called feeble-mindedness. And feeble-mindedness meant it could be attached to any of these other classifications, but that the person was also hypersexual. For African Americans, for immigrants, for anyone who was non-white, the idea of being feeble-minded meant just based upon the fact that you weren't white, you were hypersexual. And again, this is this idea of trying to balance out whose proclivities, whose birth rates are higher or lower at any given point. So you start to try and attach scientifically who you want here and who you want to breed and what you want the nation to look like. All of this is conscripted by who these people are, where they're coming from, what their race is, what their aptitude is, and if they can be assimilated into any given space or country. One of the things that you heard a lot in Belly of the Beast was the idea that it costs less to sterilize the women that were in prison than to pay as taxpayers for them to be incarcerated, to pay for their children to be without them because they would eventually have some type of either learning disabilities or mental or emotional issues based upon the fact that they had specifically a mother who was in prison. So they were, chances are they were already in care to some extent. So the belief was that in order to keep the kids from going into care, in order to keep from having to pay for food, room, housing, board for children who are poor, in order to not have to pay for the children becoming criminal, and in order for the state not to have to pay for the children having children out of wedlock, it made more sense if the woman was already on the table for a procedure that you told her she needed, or she was in there giving birth, you would automatically make it so that she had to have a cesarean. And while you had her quote unquote open, to just go ahead and snip her. This was the logic then, and it is the logic now. So when we look at Belly of the Beast, we're talking court cases from 2014 going forward, 2019, 2020, where this is still taking place. And it is sanctioned by the prison. And what you saw was that even though you had legal wrangling, the state of California really had no answers for this other than basically it's less costly to the taxpayers to do this, and the women's rights become secondary or just completely dismissed. The global pandemic of reproductive abuse, again, this has never stopped. And as women and immigration policies shift and immigrant populations enter certain spaces, you will always have them become vulnerable and targets of reproductive abuse, including forced sterilizations. I encourage you to read up on these things as much as possible. Again, this information is readily available online. And you'll start to see in places where there are detainment units, or in America, the ICE units, these women are being sterilized in record rate, or they're being told as a condition of them being let into the country, we'll let you in for asylum. However, once you're here, you're our guest, but you cannot reproduce here. Just something to consider. I know many of you who may be in England at this point, if your families came from other places, and you start to look at how the birth rates either decreased or increased once your family members were stationed and living in England, pay attention to that. I know in America, we have a thing of not talking up under people's clothes, and I respect that. There are some elders who will talk about these things, but one of the reasons why a lot of us are unaware is because the trauma that's attached to and the stigma attached to having these procedures done, being violated, keeps many people from talking about it. And every now and again, we'll have one person who'll kind of crack a little bit and offer some information and some insight. And then Acumen and my team over here starts to go through historical records to see if we can place different people in different spaces to find out what happened to them while they were in prison. Sometimes you only need to be incarcerated for a very, very short amount of time. Like you can't afford to make bail and you're waiting on a court hearing. But since you have to stay there, if you're there longer than 3 weeks, sometimes you're sent before a medical board to determine what your health is while you're there, where you need to be placed within the prison. And if at that point, say you're a woman who has fibroids, you're given a general exam. And at that point, if the warden, the superintendent of that particular prison determines, if the person is going to be here much longer, we need to go ahead and address their health needs. They are in charge of your reproductive health and not you. You don't have a say in this. All right. And so a lot of these women were sterilized, again, without their consent, without their knowledge, or it was a forced, coerced type of space where you're in prison and you really don't have a right to object to these things and have your voice heard. So just really quickly, U.S. sterilization laws that have impacted America and impacting America have gone across the pond. Buck versus Bell in 1924, Carrie Buck there was a goal to sterilize her in Virginia. She was molested, raped by a cousin. Social services came through and determined they wanted to not only sterilize her and her mother, but to also sterilize the daughter that she had later on. The Supreme Court had to rule on it in 1927, and they determined that the sterilization procedures would go forward because, as Oliver Wendell Holmes said, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. So this was, again, a distinctly eugenic situation that became law. And once it became law in Virginia, the Supreme Court took it up and it then became federal law. Mississippi sterilization laws of 1964. This, I believe, incensed me probably more than most of the issues that I've come across with sterilizations. Because civil rights was taking off in 1964, the state of Mississippi spent about a weekend where they decided to bring in about 30 to 40 different legislative mandates that they would vote on and go ahead and enact without voters ever actually seeing what the laws were. One of them was a Mississippi sterilization law that said that any Black female in the state who had a baby out of wedlock could be charged with a felony, and that felony would require a 3 to 5 year custodial sentence in the hideous Parchment prison, which is infamous for just being a backbreaker. Okay, you're going to do hard labor and all these other things. And the only condition that would keep these young Black girls out of Parchment Prison was for them to be sterilized. And within the law and the legislation, the actual notes from the law, which again, this is available online, you just have to look it up under Mississippi Sterilization Law 1964. You'll see that the conversation between the various leaders of different counties within the state of Mississippi, one of them says, as soon as you start talking about cutting these Black women open, they're going to hightail it and leave the state, and they're going to run up to Chicago or Detroit or someplace else, and they won't be our problem. The issue was not the women being immoral, having broken a law, but you're going to make it illegal for them to be there. And basically what you're saying is, if they decide to stay, they'll be in prison. If they leave, it means they have no voting rights. And we don't have to worry about them trying to access or utilize their rights as American citizens, because we don't want them here. But to make it a felony would also, again, if you're in America, you understand a felony charge in many states means that you lose your right to vote. So it was a particularly sinister space. The other thing, understanding that many Black women were targeted by Klansmen, by white supremacists, because rape was a part of that terroristic act of trying to get people out of the state and trying to keep them from voting. So it was very common to have young Black girls who were pregnant, not because they were out partying and having sex, but because they had been raped. And so to then add to that a charge of a felony charge because you're pregnant with a rapist baby, and then tell the person, in order to get out from under this, we're going to sterilize you or you have to go to prison, was just absolutely insidious. Ralph versus Weinberger, 1974. These are the young two girls that you see at the top of the screen. Minnie and Mary Alice Ralph. In 1974, they're in the state of Alabama. They were ages 14 and 12 at the time when a social worker came to their home and said, you know, there have been reports from your neighbors that there are too many little boys hanging around your house. They put the girls in a car, took them to a county hospital, and sterilized both of them. Number one, they were underage. Number two, they didn't have the consent of the parents. And the belief was, because they were already impoverished, they were living poor and on government assistance, that the state had a right to do this. It came out that the parents never gave consent, even though there was documentation that quote unquote proved that the parents had. What you find out once we get to an ACLU case, an actual federal Supreme Court case, is that the parents could neither read nor write and only signed their names with an X. So the actual signature that you saw on the consent forms had been forged. As a result, we now have what is called the informed consent laws, which means anytime you go to a hospital or you go anywhere where you have to sign documentation, there should always be someone there present who can explain what the documents say, and if you have questions, to answer those questions before you sign. That is a legal challenge that was brought about specifically because of these two young girls. However, please let it be known, they did not receive any type of compensation for the fact that they were butchered the way that they were. 2018 White County, Tennessee prison offer. This is something that still goes on currently. And the governor says that this technically could not be considered coercion, but you had prison officials who basically told anyone who was in prison, we'll let you out today or we'll reduce your sentence considerably if you agree to have a sterilization procedure done in the next week or so. And a lot of people who just wanted to get out of prison opted to go ahead and have the sterilization done because they could not stand being locked up in prison. Because it was a quote unquote offer, they got away with it. They were told to stop making those types of offers. However, this again is something that currently still takes place. If you want to get out of prison and you'll let us go ahead and sterilize you, then we'll do it. Well, who wants to stay in prison, right? And so finally, where do we go from here? One of the things that we absolutely need across the board, ladies and gentlemen, if you're going to a physician, a lot of times doctors have a way of being, really, really, they can pressure you, or they're talking in language that you don't understand. Sometimes you feel intimidated about being there and asking about medications or asking for second opinions. And so we always routinely tell you, you need to have a sister system, all right, or brother system, all right? You need to have someone who you trust, who goes in with you to doctors' offices, social workers' spaces, schools, whenever there's something that's heavy that's being discussed. You need to always partner up with at least one person. And as long as you agree to have that person there, they are there to help alleviate some of the stress, but they're also there to help you understand, and you can kind of throw things back and forth between you. Sometimes the person with you asks the questions that you're too afraid to ask. Other times they help you hear things that you're not really interpreting well, because of the stress that you're feeling while you're in that office with that professional. And then that way you all can kind of discuss things as you go. Also, if you have an option of getting back to the physician or getting back to the social worker, let us go home and talk about this, and we'll get back to you about our decision on what it is that we're going to do. Try not to be pressured by folks who are really just trying to push things on you. Take some time and have that network, that safety net of other people who you can discuss these issues with. Also, seek legal advice, seek legal assistance. There are a lot of pro bono clinics. There are people that give free legal advice. Some things you need to be able to understand without the emotion and without these other things. You need to understand what the law is, but it doesn't mean that you have to go to law school. Some of these things you really need to throw up against the wall with a person who's trained to hear and understand what it is. Do not lose contact with incarcerated relatives. Often you are the only legal resource on the outside who can challenge their abuse. I know with a lot of us, the stigma of having a relative in prison makes us kind of want to turn to the side, or they did things that we felt, they need to be in prison for perhaps. However, when you are in carceral spaces, you lose all of your rights in many instances. And it means that the only people that you can talk to about what may be going on within those prisons, within those spaces, is someone who's not returning your phone calls or your letters. All right. Leave that door open. You have to at least, keep abreast of what's going on with them, so that if something happens, we all hear about, and I hate to hear about it, people who die in custody. Right. You need to still keep your hand on folks. You still need to let the people in the prison and in these holding spaces know that there are people actively advocating for the relative who is behind that gate or that fence or that barbed wire. All right. Speak up and speak out candidly about your concerns and experiences. We have social media for everything, but most of the time it's all about the fun. But these are traumatic reproductive violations. They're impacting generations of women. And when we start talking sometimes in acumen lectures, we'll find out that there was a great-grandmother, a grandmother, a mother, a daughter, and now a granddaughter who've all experienced similar trauma, but because no one said anything, even in a closed and comfortable space, it just kept going. And so we need to try and break the trauma by giving folks, number one, a safe space to talk about these things, but being open and compassionate when we do hear these things, and try and figure out what are ways, and what legislators do we have, what attorneys do we have, what judges do we have, and we can sit down and talk to these folks and try and figure out, can we change the procedures and the protocols that surround incarceration, that surround sterilization as a whole? What is considered to be disabled? Can we try and get a different definition of this? Can we talk about access to outside help for people who have to make these decisions about their own health, their reproductive health? And finally, study the history and reach of eugenics. You will never understand how important this one little broken, antiquated word, you don't understand the power of it and how it is still very much being used. It's coming off in all types of other things, like folks today talking about status deficit, or folks talking about how Britishness, what does Britishness needs to, what does it mean in pop culture? All of these have eugenic throwbacks. And so you need to understand what this word is, what its reach is, what it means in your neighborhood, what it means in your nation, what it means in your family, okay? And so with that, Tony, I think I hit my mark. My alarm didn't go off, but I think I don't think I went too far over this. I just wanna thank you, and I'm ready to receive your questions. This is some information about Acumen. I'm gonna leave this up as my board. And maybe if I can minimize this, but please, if you have questions, you know, this is the time to ask them.
All right, you got a bunch. So let's begin. Question from George: did the women who were victimized receive justice? I think that refers to the film Belly the Beast. Did the women receive justice, as far as you're aware? Any updates on that situation?
I do, and I am absolutely pleased to let you know that reparations have been granted to a number of women in California. It's usually the women who were surgically sterilized between 1907, and the break was usually 1970, 1976. However, when Belly of the Beast came out, the legislation shifted specifically for California to include some of the women who were involved in the prison system. So yes, the women that are in the film have been compensated, or are they're about to be compensated for the abuse and the loss.
All right, there's a question here from Fahim. Does the eugenics system also exist in South Asia?
It exists everywhere. It exists absolutely everywhere. And what you may find that is that it'll be issues around birth control, first and foremost, or quote unquote family planning. It may be issues that show up within religious spaces. There may be issues within the school system where it shows up. So again, for each individual space, like I said, use your libraries. Start looking at homes, asylums, reformatories, so you can see who's being placed in them. And a lot of times when you can see who's being placed in them, you'll find your targeted group of people that this is specific to.
Siobhan says, I'm absolutely appalled by this. I live in America. As a layperson, what steps can I take to find out about these laws outside of visiting webinars like this one? So how can I find out more about these laws and this history, Dr. Shantella?
Depending on which state you're in, there's I hate to use Google straight as Google. If you go on Google, there's also a type in Google Scholar, and you'll end up with another platform for Google where you can actually put in the state where you live, and it will give you the history of eugenics in that space. At that point, you can type in, when did it end? Because some of these practices have not ended. And then that way you check in with your school system. You start looking at things like if it's Indiana, for instance, you look at Indiana to determine when did they stop doing sterilizations? Are sterilizations still taking place as what they call race hygiene or social hygiene? So they're terms. So once you start breaking, there are a number of books that just deal specifically with eugenics, and you'll start to see the terminology. So when you see things like social hygiene, that's a problem. That's always a red flag for me. Within school systems, if IQ tests and standardized testing are really prevalent, that for me is also a red flag.
Can you remind us of the name of your book, please, Dr. Sherman? What's your book called?
It's In Search of Purity. I don't know if you can see that. And so I also want people to understand with eugenics that even within your group, you will have eugenics raise its ugly head. So In Search of Purity deals specifically with African Americans who took eugenic theories and reformatted them. And there's what they call the Negro eugenics. And so Negro eugenics started again right around the turn of the century. You have W.E.B. Du Bois, and you have Booker T. Washington, and you have a group of Black intellectuals who subscribe to some bits and pieces of eugenic theory, but not all of them. So instead of talking about Black people as monkeys or this, and this, they may talk about survival of the fittest, or they may talk about evolutionary spaces, that some groups of Black people did not evolve to the point where they should have. And so those people should be regarded with the same scrutiny as, say, all Black people would under a white person's or mainstream eugenic theory.
All right, question from Michelle. What is the relationship eugenics has to epigenetics? What is the relation between eugenics and epigenetics, if there is one?
There's always one. Instead of going into the heavy science of it, when the students come through and start talking epigenetics, I always tell them the pop culture vehicles are usually the best. Again, we're talking about designer babies. We're also talking in some instances about curing diseases by looking at how genomes are formulated and how chromosomes match up, and seeing if you can take something that could be, say, a marker for Down syndrome and pull it out or reformat it, or if you can see ahead of time that you have certain ovum that are going to produce a child that could potentially have Down syndrome, that you destroy those eggs within your system while they're still in your system, okay? For me, it is all mad science, because if you don't really understand how the body works, you're gonna corrupt something, all right? So Orphan Black, the television series, it went all off in left field in many instances, but its eugenic theories and its storylines were right on point. So the idea of a woman saying, I want to have my child's eyes come out blue, and they went in to try and surgically, manipulate in utero what the child's eyes would come out looking like. And when the child was born, the child had no eyes at all. You understand what I'm saying? So you don't really know. Science still has to keep up with the creator. And so because of that, there will always be a margin for serious error.
All right. Stacy says, do the statistics around this issue show that Black women in prison who already have children are more likely to be sterilized without the consent than Black women without children?
No, it's pretty much across the board. A lot of times what'll happen is it's that IQ test that may be the trigger. So you're looking at, if this woman is in prison now and she's still of child reproducing age, she could still come out and have children that will end up being quote unquote defective. So once you're in that prison, it's assumed that, all of you are equally defective, right? So the statistics don't necessarily show that if you already have kids, you're gonna, be targeted more so than a woman who doesn't have kids. Years ago, they would lock you up for the entire course of your reproductive life. So you'll see young girls that'll go in at maybe 11 years old and they're not let out until they're 50.
Kevin says, can you discuss Margaret Sanger's connection to eugenics?
Yes, Margaret Sanger started out talking about, again, white women and the fact that her own mother was reproducing children at such a rate that it basically caused her death. And so I understood why she started this whole thing. When a woman is pregnant, once she gives birth, ultimately she should wait probably 5, 6, 7 months before she has sex again in order to give her system a chance to heal. That doesn't necessarily happen. Understanding that when Margaret Sanger got started, birth control was illegal. Birth control and abortion both were illegal. So anytime you were touched, the belief was you could get this person pregnant, or you could become pregnant from having sex, at any point. So Margaret Sanger came up with a theory that if you start having birth control, not just these, have to have condoms ready, but teaching women how to do certain things that actually became rather volatile, like douching with Lysol. And I'm talking about the old brown medicinal Lysol, which was actually toxic and caused quite a few problems. But trying to get women to understand that you're going to have to try and tell your husband that he can't. And so her theory was, if I tried to give this as a question now, I doubt that any of you would get it, but as a married couple, how often should a married couple have sex each year? The answer, once a year. All right. And even that, because the idea was if your husband has sex with you, he's going to get you pregnant. So you got to learn how to space out the children. The problem is she was also a eugenicist. Okay, so she started coming up with themes and theories about it's not just that the white women are having, poor white women are having too many babies and it's corrupting their health, but that Black women, they seem to be having the babies and tolerating it. And so you're starting to look at birth rates once again. So you start getting into Malthusian and Lamarckian eugenics, where you're talking about birth rate and we're going to run out of food and we're going to run out of energy. And you're going to have all of these Black and brown and immigrant people that are burdening the system, and the goodly white people won't have access to things, and they're also tormented because they can't keep their husbands off of them. So Margaret Sanger, I think she started out, you know, scientifically, there is a rationale to not having children in successive months, because sometimes you end up having women having children twice in 1 year, based upon the way they were having kids. However, as a eugenicist, she had what she called the Negro Project or the Negro Plan. There were a number of prominent African Americans who went for it lock, stock, and barrel. And her journal, the Birth Control Review, if you can get a hold of the June 1932 edition, is called the Negro Issue. And it has language and articles and commentary from Black leaders of the day in Margaret Sanger's journal, talking about trying to keep Black people from down South who were having still 10 and 12 kids in a family, how to keep them from reproducing, because we wanted quality rather than quantity. So yeah, Margaret Sanger, she deserves all of the scrutiny that she gets, even though I believe she started out just looking at her mother's issues for starting Planned Parenthood.
You got a question from Lena, and they say, do you think sperm banks and the ability to choose selective traits, education, race, and disability promote eugenic culture?
Absolutely. Absolutely, because it does not take into consideration environment. It doesn't take into consideration all types of other things that control how your children, how you produce great people, and again, how do you define great? So if I go somewhere and say, okay, I want my child to look like this, and okay, I want Idris Elba, you know, times 10. Okay, guess what? When a child is born, if they're in an environment where perhaps there's a highway nearby, it's depleting their lung capacity. If they're in a space, a housing space where there's mold or mildew, whatever, it's depleting their energy. If they're drinking water that has lead contaminated in it, there's all types of other things. Can I guarantee that, you know, this great child that I've now had made would not have to endure some type of sexual violation, some type of social bullying, some type of whatever that mentally will deconstruct everything I've constructed in a lab? Absolutely not. So what you're trying to do is sell people on the idea that you can create and manufacture, again, along that agrarian tool, like you do wheat or like you do animals. You can't do that. It doesn't work like that. Humans think. So what happens if the great baby decides at 17 or 18 years old to start taking a particular drug that they become addicted to? And so it's like you cannot, you know, create babies and create people that are going to go forth and just populate. That's a Nazi Germany bunch of foolishness, but Hitler got everything he learned from America. And we were doing it at least 100 years before he ever, you know, set his stuff in place.
Dorothy says, can you explain a bit more about the California law and how it's different from the national law on sterilization?
Well, the California law, again, is the national law, the California law, all of it is the same. It's all about how it's enacted, it's how it's utilized. So again, if you're when we talk about mass incarcerations in America, for instance, as long as that person ends up in a prison, then that's what that is. Then once they're there, their bodies are under the jurisdiction specifically of that particular penal system. So state by state, you may have differences, but the overarching sterilization law was, again, if someone comes through here who is defective, they're socially inept. We still have what we call mental hygiene laws that are on the books. There's a young man who is still incarcerated right now named Nushan Williams. He's been in prison now for more than 25 years. And he will probably be there, God forbid, for the rest of his life. And he started off as and he's in New York. All right, but this will kind of give you I'm going around the base to give you the response to this. He was selling drugs as a 19-year-old in upstate New York. And he was involved with several different women in one family who were exchanging sex for drugs. One of those young ladies was, I think, 15 or 16 years old. So they arrested him specifically for a statutory rape charge. If he had murdered someone, he would have been in jail for probably 12 years, 13 years, 15 years. He's been there, like I said, now for 25 years. The social hygiene law for the state of New York says that if a person is considered to be a threat, a sexual or moral threat to society, they can be held on a mental health charge as opposed to a criminal charge. And that's why they literally pulled him from one side of the criminal charge for sterilization over into the mental health side. Now, whether or not he's been sterilized at this point is unclear. What is clear is that every couple of years, they send him before a review board to try and let him out. And they say, we still believe that you're a sexual or moral threat to society. So they're keeping him there. And so again, that's old school eugenics, where we're not going to bother with the surgery, but we are going to keep you here. And we're going to keep you here for your reproductive life. So I think they're trying to keep him there until he's no longer able to reproduce.
So that links into the next question from Barbara, and they say, I know this talks about sterilizing Black women without consent, but how did they treat Black men? Were Black men also sterilized in prison, or is any connection there?
Black men are also sterilized. Overwhelmingly, Black women, Latina women, Native American women, immigrant women, they all, kind of overshadow the men. The men sometimes are given other things. They'll do a vasectomy on men, but a lot of times I think it's because it's men that are doing the surgeries where they have some type of push-pull in their own minds about performing the procedure. We may have discussed this before in another lecture. The use of additives in food in prison and sometimes in the military. One additive, we were trying to figure out what it was called, the actual name of it. It's listed as saltpeter. And
bromide, I think they called it too.
Right, bromide, there you go. And so basically, it's added to the food in prison to keep the men from being able to have erections, so that they don't become sexually aggressive inside the prisons. But over long periods of time, if you're incarcerated and you're eating this in every meal that you get, it'll kind of do what they call a chemical sterilization on you. And it just basically makes it so that you're unable to reproduce once you do come out. But women overwhelmingly became targeted, and they continue to be the ones who are most often targeted for sterilization.
All right. Jeanette says, how can I support my loved ones who are locked up in prison?
Talk to them as often as possible. If they are, sometimes they're doing Zoom. I think they've cut off actually seeing people because of COVID right now. But you know what your relatives look like. So, when we talk about this young lady from Belly of the Beast, to go from 230 pounds to 115 in a matter of about 4 months, a relative seeing her would have said, okay, wait a minute, So you need to be able to see people. You need to be able to see them. Keep in communication with them. Talk to them, ask questions, not just, how are you doing? How are you feeling? When it comes time to go to the doctors, how are the physicians treating you? What is the protocol for this type of stuff? And then you also talk to your legislators again to try and figure out your MPs. Find out, can I advocate on behalf of my son or daughter who is in whatever the prison unit or whatever the reformatory is? Can I know who the doctor is that's there? So some of these things, it's just a matter of asking the question, and what you'll find is that a lot of times you do have access, but very few people, again, take advantage of that because, again, it's a stigma attached to having a relative who's incarcerated.
Okay, it's from Angie. What is your take on the new Texas laws of pro-life? Would this too fall under the eugenics reach? Question mark.
Absolutely. One of our acumen physicians, our science editor, Dr. Sophia Sparks, is actually in Texas. And she talked about 4 or 5 years ago about the change in classification, race classification on forms in the state of Texas, where now there's certain groups of people, Hispanic people can now claim whiteness because they were starting to see, we've been talking about a shift of majority minority for a long time. And probably in 2010, folks said, when we get to 2020, America is going to be majority minority. You're going to have more Black, Hispanic, Asian, other groups will outnumber white people. So what you started having present day, the state of Texas, first of all, started saying, if you're a Latino, you can now say that you're white on these forms. So you can change your classification. That automatically changes the demographics. But at the same time, if we're looking at birth rates, the actual birth rates, the one thing that you don't want is to have white women have the ability to abort their babies. When we talk about, just unofficial, informal surveys of people, we ask most women of color, most Black women don't believe in abortion, full stop, unless something tragic has happened. Most would say, okay, if someone else has the right, they can do what they want to do. But for me personally, that's a no. So most Hispanic women, Native women, Black women, they're having their babies. A lot of white women are not. All right. And it's the same thing we're talking about with England, where you're talking about self-directed voluntary sterilization, where you're having young white people as young as 20 saying, I know I don't want to have kids, and to avoid accidentally getting pregnant, and I don't want to take birth control, I am opting to be sterilized voluntarily, and then having the NHS step in and say, no, we can't allow you to do that. Well, the thing was, if you can allow me to have a baby at 16 and it's my choice, can you then also allow me to say, I don't ever want to have a baby at 16? Why would you keep, you want me to do one, but you don't want me to do the other? Texas is in that same space of trying to grapple with, my right as a woman would be to do this or not to do this, versus I'm going to make it a law that you can't. So you have to look at who that's directed towards. So we're looking again at birth rates that are not going in the direction that folks necessarily want them to go into. And this is also political. And so the political stream I won't get into for Texas, but there's a lot of haranguing about who should be able to vote and who shouldn't, and changing districts and all of this. All of this works in tandem. It all works together.
All right, Liana says, how can we hold our doctors accountable for these sterilizations?
I would say first and foremost, go to your medical boards. Doctors have to answer to someone. You don't just get a license and then that's it. So if you're having issues with the physician, even outside of a prison wall, you need to be able to go to a medical board or whoever is responsible for the licenses of these doctors and have them question and investigate what their practices are. When you look at Belly of the Beast, one of the things that you see is that because the government, and you have different agencies that are paying for these sterilizations, there's oversight to it. It was just that no one was actually stepping in to look and say, why do you have this many sterilizations taking place coming out of the prison column? Why are there so many each month or each year? So you really need to talk to the prison board. You need to talk to medical boards. You need to find out in your area who is responsible for the licensings of these physicians. And if there is a case that needs to be brought against the doctor, how do you go about that process?
All right. Marlisha says, how do we get around smear tests? How do you get around smear tests?
How many of you believe and know and trust a homeopathic holistic doctor? I would say if you can get to a natural doctor, then find one. If you're pregnant and you can use a doula, use one. You know your body better than anyone. And so you know when something is off, chances are. Now, when it comes to trying to test for cancer cells and things like that, there are other ways of doing this. It's my understanding, just like if you have fibroids and you go to a holistic physician, the last thing they're going to tell you is, oh, let's go in and, you know, cut them out or give you a DNC. They're not going to do that. They're going to talk about other remedies, herbal solutions to try and shrink those fibroids, or what is your diet like? You know, they're going to try and figure out something else. You may not ever be able to completely get around those smear tests, but I would say check in with the holistic practitioner first and foremost to find out what those options are.
All right, Barbara says, was standardized testing started in the US for the purpose of eugenics, or did standardized tests start before that? Did any other ports of entry besides Ellis Island use standardized testing?
Standardized testing has always been eugenic, and the first standardized testing and cognitive tests that I've been able to find they were done using Civil War soldiers. So we're talking 1860, and basically with the Eugenics Records Office and some other folks, what you're trying to figure out is what the different soldiers, what their aptitude was. How do you place them? You know, so this wasn't just shooting people, right? You had to be able to show that you had leadership skills and other things. Could you read? Could you write? And so it's almost like the alpha beta test that they give you now. But the test, the eugenics came first. The testing became a part of the eugenics, and then it just kind of branched out. So you'll see the visual tests, the visual markers, that stigmata, visual stigmata that I talked about. That is where your baby contests come from. All right. It was originally called Better Babies Contest. So you would have doctors that come in and measure the babies and look at them and check their reflexes and all of these things, but also look at the space between their eyes, do actual measurements to determine what a fit baby looks like, what the best looking babies look like, what are the characteristics of a fit baby. And then from that to determine all of the things, all the characteristics that would be not normal or not fit. And from the Better Babies contest came the Fitter Families contest, which eventually would become our Miss America, Miss USA, Miss World contest, where we're trying to figure out good babies come from good mothers. And so we need to determine what a good mother should look like. So it all, the testing and the eugenics, they go hand in hand.
Marva says, where can we find research about women in the UK who have been sterilized without consent? I've recently been told by a lady in her 80s that she has just found out her ovaries have been removed and she was not aware. I feel she's not the only one. This would have been in the 1970s. Before you answer, Dr. Sherman, let me just jump in there, because there's a book called Heart of the Race by Beverly Bryan and Stella Dadsey. And that covers birth control against Black men, in that Black men, if they went to the doctor, and if they said they had fibroids, they're often recommended to have an hysterectomy. So if you had any kind of fibroid pain issues or a fibroid issue, the instant response from doctors in London or in England in the 70s was that you should have a hysterectomy. And there were also cases where people were convinced to have a hysterectomy because the doctor more or less said to do it. And that is referred to in the Heart of the Race. And also, there was a drug called Depo-Provera or Depo-Provera, which has these long-term side effects of possibly making you infertile. And that drug was dished out to Black men, not just in the UK, but also in Africa as well. And Dr. Shantella, you can take it from there.
Again, I think you hit it right on the head. I would say, one, I'm very, very sorry to hear that, you know, this woman has lost her tubes without knowing that it was done. Again, I would say, since that's the little crack in the silence, it literally becomes what physician or what doctor or what institution was this performed and where was she? And then what you'll find is sometimes you have to go through the facility's history to determine if this was something that was ongoing there. Did they have an outreach program? You know, this is me personally, I'm always a little leery when we get outreach programs that come out of nowhere. You're just kind of like, okay, if I can get to the doctor, I'll go. Or, you know, again, I prefer to use a holistic person. But when you automatically start having people come into your neighborhood to tell you, this is something that you really should try, and this is something that's really new. And it's like, yeah, but are you doing the same outreach in spaces where the women don't look like me? So it almost makes me feel like it's a setup. So that's the first thing that always comes to mind. A lot of times, if you're going through records, your census records, your data records for that particular hospital or institution or health center, or with a particular doctor, you can start to see patterns. And when you see those patterns, was there, after you have Windrush, were there specific doctors who chose to work with immigrants from the Caribbean or from Africa? That's what you need to find out. Were there, because this again was an extremely racialized space where if you had a white doctor, did he actively, you know, push to go into these communities, and was his mainstay working with the women that were there, where the men may have never been to the doctor in the 30 years that they were there, but the women all of a sudden were talking about family planning. And so again, that was that slide where I'm asking, what was the birth rate like for your great grandparents who may have still been in Jamaica versus your parents' birth rate once they got to England? Was there something different? And again, those are conversations that you're going to need to have. I think talking to, again, your older relatives, talking to some of this lady's friends, to find out if there were others who had utilized the same doctors or had been to the same facilities or were part of the same outreach programs, and you'll start to see the patterns, and then the real research gets started.
Yeah, again, if you're in England or the UK, you can actually go to the Black Cultural Archives in Brixton. They have archives of the Organisation of Women of African Asian Descent. So OAD was their name, and the Organisation of Women of African Asian Descent. And they have a lot of material on birth control issues that Black women faced in Brixton, or actually across London at that time. And to give an example, up until the 1980s, Asian women who came to England were subject to a virginity test. They were tested to see if they were virgins before they could come into the country at Heathrow Airport in Terminal 4 or 5, I think it was. And this was happening up until the 80s in this country, virginity tests on Asian women to see if they were virgins. If they weren't virgins, they would be sent back to South Asia, to India and Pakistan. That's a long story, but yeah, back to you, Dr. Sherman.
Yeah, no, I mean, you're exactly right. Again, that's that whole immigration protocol. And the belief was that if they were not virgins, it meant that eventually they would come in, get settled, and they bring their children, send for their children to come in, which again would perhaps tax the system, but it also meant that, you know, they could potentially, you know, breed other kids, have other children while they were in England. And again, you can come, but I'm not necessarily asking for you to stay here and to actually be assimilated into the culture, full stop.
Ada says, thank you so much for this webinar. I'd like to know if you have any information if the practice of involuntary sterilization is present in countries other than the US and UK. I'm in Bosnia and Herzegovina. We have no idea about this topic. I came across this event by accident, and I'm really terrified how women are treated like they are by the government.
It happens everywhere. Within the slide presentation, there are a couple of international bodies, including the United Nations, that came up with several proposals, I believe as early as 2013 or as late as 2013, where they started talking about reproductive abuses across the board. And Yugoslavia, Herzegovina, there are all of these European nations that are actually mentioned in the research. And so I will see if I can pull that through Tony and have that also available to you guys. But basically, and it reads, you know, I think one of the challenges is that it reads like a policy document. But, you know, the goal is to try and go through there, and you'll actually see where instances have taken place. It happens across the board. There's not a single place on this planet that has not had some eugenic protocol, sterilization processes. Every country has done it. Every nation has done it. And so, you know, it's kind of shocking when you actually see it, but it's there. It's
Dr.
excellent.
Sherman, can you talk a bit about Harriet Washington's book, Medical Apartheid? Because that's quite an international book, so that might help to answer the question. So Harriet Washington wrote a book called Medical Apartheid. You can actually see her give lectures on YouTube. Just tap to YouTube, Harriet Washington. But also the book is well, Dr. Sherman?
It's amazing. There are a number of books, including that one that I use in the courses that we do for Acumen, because again, I think that it's one of the most, it's pivotal, and the investigations are deep. They're also, the language is easy to read, and you start to see the connections really, really easily between your access, the belief that you potentially are a danger to the rest of society. And so sometimes, again, it's the help that's coming to you through different organizations that are actually there to curb your reproduction. And so again, it doesn't come off as birth control, because even that language would make you kind of steer back, pull back. Why would I want to control my birth rate? Da, da, da. But if I say it as family planning, then it doesn't hit you the same way. And you'll start to see, again, the belief, especially in America, but in other places as well. There's certain nations in Africa, on the continent, where you start telling African women, oh, you don't want to stay home and have babies. You want to do, you want to get out there and do this, 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 and this, and you don't want to be conscripted under these men. And it's the language of it. And I think most of us would say, yeah, you want women to go to school, and you want this to happen, and you want that to happen. That is true. But at the same time, the people who are pushing this are also pushing you to do this, because in the next breath, they're going to say, and so to ensure that you don't mess up the wonderful life that you're about to have, going to school and getting this great corporate job, you need to start taking birth control. And again, this is where Gardasil and Depo-Provera come in, where you end up getting these chemical sterilizations, these toxic cocktails that go in and just tear up your system. So it's counterintuitive on the one hand, but it hits the point, it hits the mark that it's trying to hit for the people who brought it to you in the first place. There's always been a happy balance for Black women, wherever they were, where they could have husband and children and careers. It's always been the case. So to have someone kind of come in and make you feel like you're not being modern, you're not being innovative, you're not being all you could be, because you're having too many children, or you're going to have children as opposed to getting an education and going into the career field that you may want, da, 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 da. That's still a part of a eugenic construct that someone else is bringing to you.
Okay, there's a question here from Lena. If you had the power to establish or change any law around eugenics sterilization, what would you change, or what law would you pass? What would you do if you had the power to affect laws when it comes to eugenics and sterilization?
I was about to say something really not nice. I think you need to throw it all out. To be quite honest with you, I think that it's safer to throw it all out. I have a lifelong childhood friend. Both of his parents are blind. They met blind, and they have two-sighted children. So I always think about the fact that my good friend could have been aborted, or his mother could have been targeted for sterilization because she was blind. Now, this is a family woman, and she also has a corporate job, and she's completely, fully unsighted. So who's to say who should be here? Who's to say, what person has the ability to have a child? People were concerned, he used to say, they would say, what's going to happen if, you have a baby and you can't see what the baby is doing, and you don't know and the child falls down the steps. They came up with all types of horrible scenarios for this woman and her unsighted husband as well. But these two people had two-sighted children, and both children came out wonderful, and they're both, parents themselves now, and both of their children are sighted. Who gets to determine who should have children? You don't. That's the bottom line. So I would throw it all out. And I realized that, you have people that say we can find new and innovative ways to fight diseases in the future based upon going in and doing eugenic research that deals with genomes and epigenetics and all of this other stuff. And I say, even with that, leave it alone, because you don't really know what you're going to get.
There's a comment from Gia to back up something you mentioned earlier. She says, Notting Hill, 1977. A couple of months after having my daughter, I was told several times about the joys of sterilization and a great way to avoid pregnancy and have sex without worrying about getting pregnant. It happened again in 79. That was from somebody who was in London in the 70s, literally being told to get sterilized by the doctor, I think it was.
I don't doubt it. It's just, again, if someone can sell it to you and make it your idea, then you don't even realize that you've been duped.
Oh.
And so, who wants to take a pill every day? And, you can have a carefree life and children are a burden. And so for, again, most people of Black African descent, your children are everything.
And actually, Gia just typed in again. She said, bizarrely, my GP was not the one pushing it. It was the Well Women's Clinic.
Exactly. That's my whole point. When you have outreach. So my doctor's not, you would end up going to your doctor and telling your doctor what it is that you want based upon the outreach program, which was the Women's Wellness Center. So again, the idea is just to plop it into your head. Who funded the Women's Wellness Center? So that becomes who's funding the outreach that's going in to try and convince you to do something that otherwise you wouldn't even consider. So I ask people sometimes, would your great grandmother consider this? Would your grandmother consider this? And if the answer is no, then leave it right there.
All right. So what are you working on at the moment, Dr. Sherman? And also, what is your website? In fact, tell us a bit about Acumen and what you do at Acumen and how to access information via Acumen on this topic.
Well, you can always go to the acumengroup.org. We always have something going on. Currently, I have a number of researchers. We're working in the archives themselves, going through sterilization records. And so we've targeted at least 3 different hospitals that were considered homes for the feeble-minded, and they were specific to Black women. So in Maryland, it was Crownsville. In Virginia, it was Western and Eastern State Hospital. And those records are in Richmond now. And we're trying to get down to Indiana, because again, Indiana was the first state to actually have a sterilization law in 1907. And we're going through the actual records. Some of them have been redacted, and we're trying to get to the records before they can take the names off. We want the names of the people. It's not as if we're trying to exploit them. Most of these folks have already passed away at this point. But what we're trying to do is pick up the patterns of African Americans and how they were sterilized, what brought them, what made them targets, what was the classification. And so we can see in the handwritten margins of the notes, we have the actual doctor's notes, feeble-minded, age 14. And then they'll talk about, the doctor will talk about the sterilization procedure, what medication was given, if medication was given. So something else, again, that one of our researchers, she's on vacation right now because she kind of went in and looked at some notes and realized that because you are considered subhuman as an African American, a lot of these procedures in America were done on women without the benefit of anesthesia. So you're being cut open and you don't have any type of anesthesia. So she started reading the doctor's notes and it took its toll on her. So we've given her a little bit of a break. I've been doing this long enough that I just kind of said, okay, we'll say a prayer and, pour libations if need be later on tonight. But this is kind of what the research is. The goal with the researchers now is to ensure that 2 books a year, we're going to get these records, we're going to open them back up. We're going to go through census records. We're going to deconstruct the records in order to reinvigorate the lives of these women. We're going to find out who they were. We're going to see if we can find their families. And we're going to try and bring this to the forefront so that those of you who recognize other relatives, or you see yourselves in the pages of these stories that we start pulling forward, can say something, and it'll also give you a resolve and a way of advocating for yourselves. So the Acumen Group, we have the Crack Baby Turns 30 is the current edition of the magazine that just came out a couple of days ago. It's a special edition that deals with addiction and recovery. And even in that, we're looking at the changes in protocol for how treatment is dealt with based upon race. So it used to be if a Black person ended up abusing drugs, ended up being addicted, they became throwaways. You threw them out in the street, you didn't talk about them. If they had children, you arrested them for abuse and neglect of their children, but you never talked about treating them, getting to the underlying causes of their addiction. Now that heroin and methadone and all of these other meth is tearing up America, and it's a majority white type of an addiction that mirrors crack. You know, we're suddenly talking about treatment options, and Narcor is all over the place, and how to keep these women and reassemble them and save their children and save their babies. So we look at all of that in this particular edition. You can go to the website to access the magazines, the books, and the schedule for additional lectures and courses.
And there was a question about, do you need help with the research from Marcia? Do you need help with the research from Marcia?
Always. We're accepting stringers everywhere. And so if you're interested, there's also a space on the website where you can volunteer, where you can donate. And sometimes donation is not money, donation is your time, because it's a lot of records, and a lot of the records are digital now, so you don't have to physically go into the archives, but it's time consuming. And so we want to make sure that anyone who's interested can pull these files and look at them and help to bring this information forward. So please get in contact with me. My email address should be on one of these slides, and we'll definitely add you to the fold.
So, and apart from Acumen, are there any other groups that campaign against sterilization or eugenics or racist sentencing or unfair laws in the first place?
There are a host of them. I don't necessarily, you know, I still like the grassroots way of doing this, which is each person start with a family history and work your way out from that. Again, I believe that a lot of you can see this bookshelf behind me is packed all the way down. Unfortunately, fortunately, many of the books that are on this wall behind me, even if they're written about African Americans or Black people diasporically, they're not written by Black people. And so I feel the same way about a lot of the organizations that deal with this. A lot of the folks that are trying to bring things to the forefront related to African Americans are not necessarily African Americans themselves. They're not Black people, they're not diasporically Black. And so I'm always trying to figure out, what is the end game for you doing this? You know, what is it about this? And it could be just that people have a soft heart, but I'm always of the belief that when we as Black people go in and we look at research, we look at data, we're looking at it from a very personal space. And because you're looking at it from a personal space, you see things that other people don't see. You see things written in a language that is not necessarily known by other folks. You see coding, you see, you know, sometimes there's video that we go through. You'll see a look or a glance or body posturing, and you say, I know what that means. And it doesn't have to be something that's verbal. And so again, organizations, there are plenty of them. ACLU is out there. They handled the Relf sisters, but the fact that the Relf sisters walked away with no money, I'm not sold on them. Another person who was represented by another organization, which I won't name, the sterilization court case went all the way through the jury process. They said that, you know, yes, this was actually a case of eugenic sterilization that was unfounded and should be, the woman should be compensated. And then the total amount that the jury came back that she should be compensated with was $5. All right, so this is onward, upward, always, but it's in our hands. And so, yeah, I look forward to just branching Acumen out into different areas. Other folks can join in. Dr. Wilmer Leon is a political scientist who's on XM radio. He does a lot of the research with us. I trust him to get in and knock some of this stuff out. Raw Andrews, who is, again, a lawyer. He's over at the Psychiatric Institutes of Washington. I trust him to get in and pull the information and the documents. And so each one of these folks will have their own projects that they're working on, which will pull back into Acumen. And I think that in doing it that way, I feel a bit safer about it.
All right. comment here from Michelle. It says, "You are beyond phenomenal, Dr. Dr. Sherman is not what she meant to say, I think. My life is bettered for attending this webinar today. Thanks a million." And we're going to be winding up in about 5 minutes. So if you've got anything to say to Dr. Shantella Sherman, you can just tap in the chat before we disappear. Yes, other people saying, wonderful presentation, learned so much. I'm on the floor. I can't believe this sort of thing is taking place. I'm going to get all the books that you mentioned and do a whole bunch more research. This is what I'm just summarizing comments people made here, because we're going to finish in about 5 minutes and lock this off. And Dr. Sherman, actually, do you still have that presentation on eugenics in popular film and TV?
I do. I do.
Right, cool. We should arrange to do that again in the next couple of months or so, because that was very interesting.
Perfect. Perfect. Yeah, I always say that a lot of times we're looking for the heavy science of eugenics, or we're talking about housing policies or education policies, but we watch eugenic constructs all day, every day, whether it's advertising, social media, the favorite television programs that you watch, it's all there. And I think it may be covered over, but you'll see one of our covers, we did Coronation Street. We just wanted to look at and examine eugenics and some of the themes there. Again, sometimes it's about race. Other times it's strictly about eugenics in and of itself, in its most natural form, if you want to call it that. So even if the characters aren't Black, you start to see things about alcoholism or about generational curses and things like that that pop up in your television series.
And there's that Brazilian drama called 3%. I think that you mentioned that too once or twice.
Yeah, there's a lot. I mean, we even deal with the TV show Luther. I think they're getting ready to slate that for film now. We had some issues. I had some issues with the show, but that's a whole different.
That's a whole nother 3-hour presentation, right?
Right.
All right, that's it for now. We're going to end this stream in literally 2 minutes from now. So you got time to say goodbye to your friends that you've met online. And I'll say thank you to Dr. Shantella Sherman. We'll hopefully see you again in the near future. And check out our website, blackhistorywalks.co.uk, for more similar events in the next couple of months, because we have about 15 events like this coming up shortly. So check out blackhistorywalks.co.uk and also the Sarah Parker Remond Centre. Other than that, we're going to switch this off in literally 2 minutes from now.
All right. Again, guys, thank you so much. I'm gonna see if I can put in the chat an email address, if I can do that, where you are more than welcome to send your questions if you were too shy to get them out here. All right. So yes, please visit us often, check us out. I'm not really a social media person because I'm in the archives more often than I'm not, but I do have a bunch of young students. We take volunteers all the time who manage the social media pages and all of that. So we're trying to keep tabs on any and everything that's eugenically linked or has eugenic tentacles to it, to make sure that you're aware of what's there.
And one more thing, I did mention U.C.L. There's an academic there called Subhadra Das, and she has done a whole bunch of research into eugenics at U.C.L. She actually designed like a history walking trail of the buildings in U.C.L. that are linked into hardcore eugenics, white supremacy. So if you tap in bricks and mortals, the last name is DAS, so Badra Das. That you can find her work online. So if you tap in Bricks and Mortals by Subhadra Das, Das is spelled DAS, you should find her research there. And actually it's like a kind of a podcast. So you can actually do a eugenics history walk in UCL, which is in central London near Good Street. And it's very, very interesting. So this is going to switch off now in 60 seconds from now. We're going to switch it off. Thank you very much.
Mhm.